Over the years, I've seen many different 3D printing manufacturers come onto the scene. Some of them have been successful, while others have quickly risen and just as quickly fallen. One of the companies that's been around for quite a few years now is Anycubic, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. I first heard of Anycubic back in 2017 with the release of their Anycubic i3 Mega. And although I didn't have one of these printers, a lot of my buddies swore by their i3 Megas, and looking at what was currently available at the time, they were definitely a significant upgrade from the previous generation of budget desktop 3D printers. Now, although I never got a chance to use the original i3 Mega, I did test out the i3 Mega X last year, which was at the time the latest addition to their Mega line, which had a bigger build volume and quite a few upgrades. And also, one of my earlier printers back in 2017 was the Anycubic Castle, which was my first successful rendezvous with a Delta 3D printer. I'd tried a couple previously and was really never able to get them dialed in well, and so with the Castle, I really enjoyed the upgrade and calibration process, and I did get it tuned pretty well, and it did perform. I had some really awesome prints that came off of it. Well, a couple of months ago, Anycubic reached out to me, giving me a list of specs for a new 3D printer that they were going to be releasing called the Anycubic Vyper. And based on those specs, it seemed like a major upgrade and a huge overhaul from their previous line of Mega printers, and kind of what I would describe as Anycubic's next generation of desktop 3D printers. So over the past couple of weeks, I've been testing out the Anycubic Vyper, and I am excited to show you guys this printer today. In today's video, we're going to talk about the Anycubic Vyper specs, we're going to talk about what the setup and calibration looks like, we're going to do plenty of 3D printing, and ultimately in the end, I will give you my final opinion on this printer. There's definitely a lot to cover, so without further ado, let's get right into today's video. Like we typically do, let's first start off with the specs for this printer. The Anycubic Vyper has a build volume of 245 by 245 by 260 millimeters. It is a 24 volt system running Marlin on a 32-bit board with TMC 2209 drivers. The printer is primarily made up of aluminum extrusions along with a few injection molded parts. It uses a Bowden extrusion system with a filament runout sensor and a dual geared extruder that, other than being inside of a clear shell, looks near identical to a BMG extruder. The hot end is not all metal, but does have a large heater block and long nozzles, reminding me a lot of the Volcano hot end. This will allow you to melt more filament quicker, and I've really become a fan of this style hot end. The stock bed on the Vyper is a powder coated PEI bed on a magnetic flex plate. This is without a doubt the best bed that I've seen on a budget 3D printer like this. They definitely made me proud with their choice for bed on this printer. Leveling is completely automatic on the Vyper, and there are no springs to adjust on the bed. The printer uses dual lead screws for the Z-axis with anti-backlash nuts. The Z-axis also has two end-stop sensors, one for each side when homing the printer. This is really going to help to make sure that the printer stays aligned and will adjust if either side of the printer is thrown out of alignment. As for printing, you can print over USB or using a full-size SD card on the very nice 4.3-inch touchscreen. If you've watched my last couple of 3D printer reviews, you know that both printers I reviewed that had touchscreens had a very annoying beeping sound anytime you touched anything on the screen, with no option to turn it off. Well, I was hoping this wasn't going to be the case, and I am pleased to announce that there is a very simple setting built into the screen where if you click it, none of your presses will make a beeping sound. Great job, Anycubic. Please, everybody else, do the same thing. The Vyper does have built-in X and Y belt tensioners, as well as a storage drawer that is built in with foam inserts and contains all the tools for this machine. Like I typically do, I went ahead and removed the bottom panel of the printer so that way we can take a look at the mainboard. Doing so, I discovered that the mainboard fan was much larger than any other printer I've seen. At a glance, I believe it was an 80mm, which had me excited thinking about noise levels. The 32-bit board inside was a Tri-Gorilla version 0.0.6, which had the stepper motor drivers embedded into the board. I didn't see many ports available for things like expansion, but given that the normal things that these printers you'd want to expand upon would be a filament runout sensor and automatic bed leveling, which are both included, it didn't really bug me. I did also notice though that towards the front side of the board, it looked like there was a slot for a stepper motor driver, but upon thinking about it more, I actually believe it is a spot for a small ESP Wi-Fi module. So it is possible, I haven't heard anything official from Anycubic, but it is possible that they may release some kind of an add-on, which will allow you to very easily add Wi-Fi to this printer. The Anycubic Vyper came packaged incredibly well with plenty of foam on both sides to make sure that it wasn't damaged in transit. As far as the build guide goes, there's both a paper booklet included with this printer as well as a PDF copy on the SD card. I've gotten used to checking the SD card now to see if there is any video build guide, because I've seen a couple of manufacturers do this, and in the case of the Vyper, there currently was not. That being said, this is definitely a brand new printer, and so it is possible that by the time you receive one, if you get this printer, that you might have that. So I would say it's always worth checking the SD card just to see what kind of goodies are included on there. As far as assembly goes, I really don't think it gets much easier. There are 4 screws that are used to bolt the bottom frame to the top frame, 3 screws to bolt the touchscreen to the front right of the frame, and the spool holder, which just snaps into the left side of the aluminum extrusions. There was a note in the printer box, but there was 4 zip ties on my printer. I think it was 1 on the hot end carriage, 1 on the bed, and 2 on either side of the Z-axis. So you will definitely want to make sure that you cut those before turning on the printer and homing it, or you could damage something. Even if you are a beginner, I really don't see how this assembly process can take more than 30 minutes. And if you've been printing for some time, it's probably a 15-minute assembly. So once I had the printer together, I went ahead and powered it on and went through the initial calibration or leveling process, which is super simple. It's outlined in the guide, but basically you're just going under setup or prepare, and then there is a leveling button which will go around and probe 16 spots on the bed. It does take a little bit as it's moving slow, but in the time that I've printed this, I've only had to do it once right at the beginning, and it has stayed completely level since, which is thanks to the fact that there's no springs on the bed, so there's not much that can become loose, and the fact that there's a flex plate system, so when you're removing prints, you're not putting pressure onto the bed. Once leveled, I plugged in the included SD card to see if there was any pre-sliced files on the SD card, and I was actually a bit surprised because when I plugged it in, I didn't see anything at all. So I took it over to the computer and did discover 2 folders. One was in Chinese and one was in English with the exact same items, just one English version and one Chinese version. And I quickly discovered that this printer does not have the ability to go into folders. Like in the actual file explorer, the things need to be on the root of the SD card, which really isn't a big deal to me, but I do think that the G-code file probably should come on the root of the SD card. So I went ahead and dragged it, plugged it into the printer, and hit print with the PLA I had loaded in. And part of the instructions do say on the first print to keep an eye on it, because as it starts going, if it's too close or too far, you'll want to adjust the baby stepping or the Z offset. However, once it started printing, it was actually spot on and I didn't have to adjust anything at all. The test print was of a fairly small owl, which if my memory serves me correctly is actually Anycubic's kind of like go-to test print for many of their FDM printers. And although the print did turn out fine, I did find it a little bit odd that it actually wasn't centered on the bed, which leads me to think that maybe it was sliced for a different machine altogether. And the print, though, again, it did turn out fine, with the only exception being a little bit of stringiness between the owl's ears. Once that print was done, I was ready to go ahead and hop over to the computer and slice up some files of my own. The instructions have you setting up Cura as the slicer for this printer. The steps are essentially to open up Cura, select the i3 Mega printer profile, which is baked into Cura, renaming it to the Anycubic Vyper, and adjusting the build volume. They do have 3 profiles built onto the SD card, which are PLA, ABS, and TPU, which you can import after the fact. Although I do love Cura and I've used it for years, I recently switched to an M1 Mac Mini, and Cura has been terribly glitchy and crashing constantly. Due to this, I recently started using Prusa Slicer because it seems to be the only slicer that is running very stable on the M1 Mac Mini. Seeing that the profile for this was basically just a copy of the i3 Mega, which is also built into Prusa Slicer, I ended up using that instead for the majority of my prints. For the first print, I went with a baby Rancor model that Chaos Core Tech recently released on their thanks page. I sliced it up at 0.2mm layer height and hit print. This was a fairly long print compared to the test file, but I was quite happy with the end results. Upon inspection of the part, I noticed there seemed to be some slight under extruding at random. I then took a deeper look at the initial owl print and also saw at least 1 or 2 lines of this. So I adjusted the tension on the extruder and swapped out the filament for some protopasta that I know is a great material. I ended up finding a model of an Aztec temple that was kind of a planter, which I knew Erin would love for her garden, and so I went ahead and downloaded that, sliced it up with the exact same settings, and hit print. I did check on the print a couple of times throughout the printing process just to make sure I didn't see any under extrusion, and I was able to confirm that the adjustment of the tension screw and the swapping of the filament did seem to get rid of the under extrusion issue. With this print having a fairly large base, I was able to really see how well the bed leveling worked, and I definitely was impressed. I've used plenty of budget 3D printers that come with automatic bed leveling that is quite terrible. Either the hardware is just cheap or somehow it's not implemented correctly in the firmware. So to see such clean layers back to back, again, especially on this print, which was a bigger base, was really exciting to me. One thing I noticed with the 3D prints so far was that there was a bit of stringiness, and looking at the printer, this actually made a lot of sense to me. For starters, it is a Bowden type extrusion system, but more so, it has what is basically a volcano heater block, and the heater block is going to be much larger than a standard heater block, which the benefit of that is it takes larger nozzles and you can use larger diameter nozzles, and it also allows you to just melt material quicker, which is awesome for trying to print faster. However, a byproduct of that is that it typically is a little bit more stringy. And I, thinking back, have only used a volcano heater block on a direct drive printer, and so being that this is a Bowden, again, I can understand why there's a little bit of stringiness. I do, however, think that the adjustment of the temperatures for the filament as well as dialing in the retraction could definitely help to alleviate this, and I've been using the same temps that I would typically use for any printer on this, and that might be a little bit overkill considering that it does have that larger heater block. After the two-part Aztec temple, I did go ahead and do another large print, at least as far as the bed's build surface was. I'm going to be building a Voron 0.1 pretty soon here, and one of the things is that there is a ton of screws that I had to order, and they all came in either unmarked bags or they came in bags with a Sharpie of some sort that seems to have smeared in transit. So having this little container that I can put all the screws into is going to be really nice, and I was very, very happy with the end result. I had a little bit of MatterHacker's natural build series PLA, which is what I was able to use up. I had just a little bit more than enough, and using two M3 screws, it does have a hinge. So again, functional print, and I am very happy to have this in my box of Voron parts. Next, I completely switched gears, and like I had mentioned, there was profiles for ABS, PLA, and TPU. My dad had just told me a couple of weeks ago on his birthday that he really liked my printed TPU phone case. It's incredibly dirty, but it's awesome because I always have something 3D printed on me, and it's a great conversation piece. And so my dad, being a huge fan of my channel and thinking this is pretty rad, had requested a phone case for his phone as well. And so I went over to Thingiverse. He has a little bit older, it's an iPhone SE, the original, and so I was able to find two phone cases that I downloaded, and I actually decided to use Cura for this because I wanted to use their profile, and although Cura is buggy on the M1 Mac Mini, it's typically buggy on more complex shapes, and phone cases are typically just rectangular and not very large, so I imported them into Cura. I selected the TPU profile, and I was really surprised by the print speed that was set to default for this TPU profile. Call me a skeptic, but over the years I've done enough TPU printing to know there is no way in hell on a setup like this I'm running TPU at 80 millimeters a second. Is it possible? Maybe, but it's definitely not what I'm going to be starting with, considering 80 millimeters a second is actually faster than I print even standard rigid material normally. So I took that 80 millimeters a second and dropped it down to a safe 30 millimeters a second and sliced up the part. I believe I kept almost everything else the same, but yeah, the speed was just pretty outrageous in my mind. Normally I don't like batch 3D printing, and especially with a flexible filament, but the adhesion had been so good and so consistent on this printer so far, even with large parts, that I figured, let's try printing both at a time and see what happens. So I sliced up the file, hit print, and I watched the first probably 5 or so layers go down and was really impressed by just how clean the lines were. I mean, they looked really, really good. And I'm not gonna lie, I did go to bed at that point, and part of me was a little bit worried in the back of my head that I was going to wake up to some kind of weird TPU spaghetti mess, but that was not the case. I had two really nice looking phone cases sitting on the bed of the printer waiting for me when I woke up in the morning. The solid case did have some pillowing on the top, which was actually my fault. I think if I look back at the slicer, the default setting only had maybe 2 top layers, and so I should have done a couple more, but it won't have any effect on the actual phone case and is not visible when the case is on the phone. And the mesh case turned out absolutely perfect. Thinking back, this is probably the best TPU prints I've gotten on any printer, period, especially a stock printer. I've done quite a few mods of different printers and made some that can print TPU very well, but considering this is a Bowden setup and again, this is completely stock, I've done nothing to it, this printer can print TPU, so if you want to print flexibles, the Vyper can absolutely do it. Once the TPU prints were done, I decided to throw some PETG on this printer. I found a model over on Thingiverse that was called Soldering Fingers, and it basically allows you to put different wires together, twist them together, and it kind of holds them in place while you're soldering. And given that I'm going to be doing quite a bit of soldering again on this Voron build, I figured, hey, this is a pretty practical print and something I could probably use down the road. So I loaded up some eSun PETG. It was black. I actually had some left over from the Songbird turntable build that I did, God, probably 2 months ago now. And I loaded that up and I hit print. And the adhesion was laying down beautifully. The layers were looking absolutely gorgeous. However, once it got to the top where the actual like fingers were of it, it started to look really ugly, and I was really confused until I got close to the printer and heard spitting and popping sounds, which led me to realize that this PETG was wet, although it was only a couple weeks old and it printed perfectly just a couple weeks ago, which makes me think that I jinxed myself because I just talked to a buddy about how I've hardly ever had issues with PETG even after months being here in California, but that's what I get for opening my mouth. But yeah, this material was definitely wet, and I tried to get a little recording of the popping sound. I don't know if you can hear it, but if so, I will place that here. Although the fingers on the print definitely don't look good, as far as functionality goes, this thing is going to be able to work for its intended application. However, I also had a spool of blue eSun PETG that I opened at the exact same time, and I decided to just throw it on the printer, hit print again, and just see, is it going to look exactly like the black PETG? And it definitely ran into a similar issue when I got to the finger portion where there's a little bit of moisture in it, but it was not as extreme as the black PETG. Again, the adhesion with this powder-coated PEI on PLA, TPU, and PETG was absolutely fantastic, and I think I got some shots of the bottoms of these parts because damn, they are just really, really consistent, and I've been very happy with the leveling as well as the adhesion that the Vyper has offered. For a final print, I swapped back over to PLA to kind of create a sandwich. We'll start with it and we'll end with it, and I found a small little screw organizer that allows you to check quickly, is it a M2, M3, M4 screw, and what is the length of it? And the numbers on this little measurement device were sticking up, and so what I did was I started the print in blue PLA, and then I did my best to just kind of eyeball and pause it, and I swapped it out for white PLA, and it's not perfect because, again, I didn't enter the G-code command in the slicer, I just eyeballed it, but it is still going to be more than good enough for, again, the Voron build, and I'm excited to have a couple of these accessories that I think might make the build a bit more enjoyable and hopefully make it where there's a little bit less hair pulling. So what are my final thoughts on the Anycubic Vyper, at least as of now with all of the printing that I have done? Currently, there is a pre-order for $359 with them. I believe their website says the early bird or the earliest shipping is June 30th, so by the time this video goes live, it should be shipping out any day. Now, $359 is definitely a bit more expensive than some of the other printers that we've covered on this channel, at least as of lately. However, there is definitely some additional features for this printer that does add value to it. The automatic bed leveling and the PEI powder-coated flex plate are two upgrades that a lot of people like to do, and I would say that in general, just rounding, that's probably about $100 value in my mind. However, you don't have to go through the trouble of wiring in some kind of an automatic bed leveling, calibrating the firmware, and doing all that stuff. It's just ready to rock and roll out of the box. As much as I like touchscreens, the touchscreens on the past couple of printers that I have reviewed have been very annoying to me because of the beeping, and again, I am very pleased with the touchscreen, both the fact that you can mute the audio and that the text is quite small. Not quite small where it's hard to read, but small enough to where you can kind of see what the name of the print is in the File Explorer, which was a complaint I had on a few other printers. Also, the fact that it's got a BMG style extruder as well as a Volcano style heater block or hot end, that is much better than the typical cheap plastic extruders that come on a lot of the low-cost printers and the kind of generic hot end that those have as well. With that being said, if I had a choice between direct drive or a Bowden system, I would almost always opt for direct drive, but I was incredibly impressed with this printer's ability to print with flexible filament. Really, there's only two things about this printer that I'm not crazy about, and the first is related to the breakout board where the hot end's at. I tried to take apart the kind of fan housing to take a look at the hot end, and it was very difficult to do. It didn't seem like the plug that went into the breakout board was able to be removed. I did press on it. I did try pulling on it a bit, and I was actually concerned that I might be damaging something. So what that means is, if you're going to want to try to mod something, or you're going to want to try to repair something, it's not going to be the easiest to do. Now, I don't think modding this printer is that big of a deal, because kind of how it's laid out, you shouldn't really need to do much modding to it. But for the sake of repairs, like if a fan goes out, it's definitely going to take a bit more work to get in there and get that fan replaced than on a printer where you just undo the screws and the whole thing pops right out. Lastly, and I know I sound like a broken record with almost every printer or a grumpy old man, but it's the sound that the printer makes. Again, the 80mm fan on the board versus the tiny little like 40 or 30mm fans that typically come on the control boards had me excited, because bigger fan typically means less sound. Usually the smaller, higher RPM produces more sound, and that actually was the case. The board wasn't the issue. For some reason, on the hot end, when I believe it's the layer cooling fans hit certain RPMs, it makes a pretty high-pitched sound, and I couldn't exactly figure out what was triggering it, and it was only for a short period of time, maybe a couple of minutes, and then it went away, but it was definitely a little bit of an annoyance, and it was like sort of that, what I would describe as almost like a dog whistle sound, what I would imagine that sounds like. But again, it was only for a few minutes at a certain RPM, but something that I noticed, and I'm going to keep complaining about sound until we have super quiet printers. Aside from those two things, I do feel like the printer profiles can definitely use some work. Just the things I saw as far as like the G-code file for the sample part being off-centered on the bed, and the TPU profile showing at 80mm a second, which to me is ridiculous. I wish they had spent a little bit more time tuning those profiles, and maybe by the time this printer is actually, released and shipped, they have updated them, but all I can go based off of is what was presented in front of me. Overall, I've really enjoyed using the Anycubic Vyper, and a combination of the bed leveling that they've implemented and that powder-coated PEI bed is a real treat to work with. If you're on a budget, but you're looking for a 3D printer that has quite a bit of features that's not going to require any upgrades or tweaking, then the Anycubic Vyper is a real solid contender. Coming from the Anycubic Mega to the Anycubic Vyper is a huge upgrade. Anycubic really did pack a ton of features into this machine, and really aside from the profile things which will get squared away, the hardware seems really well dialed in. The fact that I just plugged this thing in, pressed a button, let it do its leveling thing, and it was ready to rock and roll throughout all of these test prints, and the results were incredibly consistent, is awesome. And I had said earlier on that this, based off the specs, it seemed like Anycubic's next-gen printer, and after using it for the past couple weeks, I gotta say that, yeah, it really does feel like it is a next-gen printer for them, and I think that Anycubic did an awesome job with it. If you do want to find out more or purchase one of these printers for yourself, I will place links down below over to their website where they have like the pre-order thing, which again, by the time this video goes live, it will be very close to at least the early batches of these printers shipping out. If you have any questions about anything that I said or did not say in this video, let me know in the comments down below, and I will do my best to answer. If I don't have the answer, as always, I have no problem reaching out to Anycubic directly and trying to get that answer for you. On that note, don't forget to like and subscribe for more great videos. We make a video every single week, so there is always fresh content coming your way. And if you do want to support the channel furthermore, I'll place links down below in the description over to my Patreon, where there are some really awesome rewards. A huge thank you to all of my existing Patreon supporters. I appreciate each and every one of you guys allowing me to spend more time and come back each and every week doing what I love, which is making content for you guys to enjoy. On that note, this has been Daniel from ModBot, and I look forward to seeing you guys in my next video. Peace, guys.